Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure today, and it's something very private also, to go for the next speaker, the Ambassador of France. Because Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, la France, cher pays de mon enfance, the country of my childhood. The President Macron, in his speech in 1917, maybe 3 years ago, at the General Assembly in New York, advocated very strongly, called very strongly for new multilateralism as a unique way to face the troubled period we are living in today. And since that, many head of states followed, but the voice of President Macron was very, very strong, and it's a great pleasure to have you, Mr. Ambassador, today to tell us how, seen from France, a permanent member of the Security Council, how you see the development of multilateralism and this call for a new multilateralism. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for coming. Excellencies, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, students also, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a very challenging subject, and let's say that in this attempt, which is multilateralism, to create an order based on rules, mutually agreed, mutually respected, mutually guaranteed by all international actors, France has for a very long time been in the forefront. Well before 1945. It has participated in all international conferences. I will remind the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It was the promoter of the League of Nations. And let me remind you that 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the award of the Peace Nobel Prize to Léon Bourgeois, who was a French statesman and first chairman of the Council of the League of Nations, for his contribution to the edification of what we call collective security, which is at the heart of the UN Charter and more globally the multilateral system. What are the reasons for this French commitment? Perhaps our history, 1,000-year-old history, geographic situation, and the lessons learned from the past have taught us, where we had war with almost all our neighbors and beyond, has taught us precisely this lesson. And let me quote President Mitterrand in 1995 when he went to Strasbourg, and at that time we had 15 member states in the European Union, and he started his intervention by saying, France has been at war with every individual member of the European Union throughout its history, except for Denmark, and I really don't know why. And so I guess this is one of the lessons of the past, that of course when you wage a war, you always intend to succeed. We've done some, we've had to support some, but the reality, the lesson learned, is that we will lose from confrontation. The second, perhaps, commitment is also linked to the values of the French Revolution of 1789, which we think, and they have been recalled in the United Nations Charter of Human Rights for 1948, that they are universal rights, universal human rights, equality of rights, rule of law, and this is on which universal conventions are based. I'd like to say, because the UN system is very criticized, but it has produced multilateralism with some very positive results. I come from Vienna, where I was ambassador to the UN, and let me remind you, for instance, that the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, which is the 50th year, is not perfect, but NPT and IEA succeeded in avoiding broad nuclear weapons proliferation. The WTO, World Trade Organization, which needs to be reformed, has succeeded also through several rounds to foster international trade and growth, which was beneficial worldwide. Let me quote also the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which was signed in 20,000. And it is a minimal basis for universal judicial cooperation in the fight against crimes. So you have bilateral agreements, but when you don't have bilateral agreements, this is the minimum rule that allows countries to cooperate. But of course, the multilateral system is challenged, and in fact, all multilateral organizations from the past fell apart and generally leading to wars. This is a lesson from the past. But unfortunately, they are challenged. First of all, the values on which they are based are challenged. I think, for instance, of the notion of the relativity of human rights, that there will be different understandings of human rights according to climate, which is, of course, something we don't share. The confrontation of some values, like freedom of speech towards freedom of religion, makes it, of course, difficult because the values are challenged. There is a temptation for unilateralism, of course, which leads, in fact, to less stability, and Minister Dacic told me, I think it's a very important word, predictability. Because when you don't know what your neighbor is going to do, it leads to fear, it leads to questions, and this is a negative step. So, temptation for unilateralism, which is very clear, leads to less stability and predictability. I can only give you the example of the JCPOA deal in Iran, for instance, where the fact that the international community, unfortunately, does not stick together anymore on this dossier just creates the fact that Iran is accumulating enriched uranium, unlike it was provided for in the agreement. And then last point, let me mention COVID also. Of course, it's not a key element, but I think the existence of the organization is important because they allow the system to function. And in this organization, you have some kind of culture of dialogue. And in fact, when you meet your interlocutors, it's difficult to have rude words. And I think hostile words lead to hostile acts. And the fact of meeting together is a very important element of understanding, knowledge, mutual trust. So unfortunately, I think COVID is a danger to that, not only because WHO was threatened for lack of cooperation and politicization of their work, but also the culture of dialogue, which is the key for avoiding conflicts, by definition is disappearing. We have Visio conference, it's very nice, it replaces things, but it does not replace this contact. I can give you an example. Discussion is always worthwhile. When I was in Vienna, we had regular meetings of the P5 countries, which means United States of America, Russia, China, UK, and France. When you read the papers nowadays, you really wonder what these countries can build together. But we do. And in fact, these discussions were extremely useful discussions. We had alliances that you can't even imagine. And this is the reason why also our president, like the Russian president, is calling for a P5 meeting at heads of state level, but which has not yet been implemented. What can France do to improve this multilateral system? 3 things. For instance, we try to promote this culture of dialogue, and this is the Alliance for Multilateralism, which was launched in the German-French meeting of the foreign ministers in 2019, which is an informal alliance of countries gathering 50 ministers for foreign affairs today, and more are welcome, Minister Deputies is very much welcome, to coordinate their action in promoting multilateralism. The aim is to discuss the way to reform our system, to defend international norms, and also to launch concrete initiatives in fields that where there is a lack of governance, for instance, of security in the cyberspace. The second thing that we are doing is try to make a more inclusive multilateral system, and this is the meaning of our action towards the enlargement of the Security Council and the increase of the number of permanent members, which would, to our view, more reflect the state of play of the international actors nowadays, where Africa, for instance, will have some permanent member seats, or even other continents. Third thing are the promotion of new forms of multilateralism, which take more into account globalization. Today, multilateralism is very much among governments, among states. We need to bring in new actors. I mean, some companies have more role than some governments. So we have to imply governments, NGOs, universities, as was said by our interlocutors before, foundations, companies, academies, researchers, civil society. And to that aim, this is what President Macron is also aiming at with the Paris Peace Forum that was launched 3 years ago, with the heads of state 100 years after the end of World War II, and which gathered participants from all these forums to reinforce international cooperation and multilateralism. And ideas that come from universities, action that comes from NGOs, are always extremely welcome. Let me quote, for instance, that last year was during the second World Peace Forum in Paris, the call of Christchurch, which brings together governments and enterprises to fight against terrorist contents on the internet and to act more efficiently. Because governments cannot do this if companies are not doing it. Last thing, I would like to close with a last specific remark on the European Union. Of course, this is at the heart of our foreign policy, because the European project is a very specific scheme of international cooperation. It is more than multilateralism, because it brings to fully integrated bodies and policies, and less than states. So I wouldn't say that for us, France, uses multilateralism. It is not. It is our nation. And despite the difficulties of the critics, it has managed for more than 60 years to strengthen its institution while welcoming new members to assure peace, democracy, and development among its members. This is why the conditions to join the EU are severe, in order not to import instability inside a fragile construction, but of course you know that Serbia is most welcome. And then I have to say that despite economic strength, efforts need to be made to make the EU a fully relevant actor in the field of security inside the multilateral framework. So France believes that the right level for its security is the EU. And President Macron is pushing towards a strategic autonomy of the EU for more means, for an autonomous capacity of action of the Europeans around the strategic culture of its own and strategic vision. There are still some steps to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Falconi. I have to say, first, I am very pleased by this speech, because what I'm going to say in my conclusion afterwards. Yeah? So I will not thank you for that, Mr. Ambassador. But I'm also very grateful because it's a strong voice from a member of the permanent member of the Security Council, and to have this open vision of a new kind of cooperation between governmental and non-governmental state actors, it's for sure the perspective of dialogue, as you mentioned, as a key moment to avoid any conflict. Yeah?